Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We just had a pretty extensive video on bebop and how it was so different from the swing era that came before it. Okay, and I kind of talked about a pendulum going back and forth. So the swing era was not exclusively full of these pop bands, but there were a tremendous amount of pop bands playing a lot of pop tunes. And so bebop, in many ways, is a reaction against that. It's not a big band; it's a small group. It's not arranged music that is played the same night after night. It is heavily based on improvisation, no written arrangements. It is, again, changing into an art form about the soloist. People aren't dancing to it, they are sitting down and viewing it like a concert and taking it in under those circumstances. Um, uh, right. Oh, and degree of difficulty, just much, much, much harder in pretty much every context, right? The problem with music that moves so far over in one particular spectrum, and in this case, degree of difficulty, is you're going to lose a lot of fans. There's a lot of people who were swing era fans, like the tunes, like to dance, like to whatever, and now they can't follow bebop, so now they're off listening to rhythm and blues or country and western or other sort of just standard American pop songs. Okay, so the intent of bebop was great, to make the music more challenging and to sort of bring everybody along and say, look how innovative we are and can you dig this? But it lost a lot of people. So the pendulum is once again kind of going to swing back to a more moderate, easy to follow, easily approachable sort of music, and that's called cool jazz. So if you think of the bebop era really exploding around 45, 46, 47, right as the swing era was ending, it didn't take very long, and bebop would continue. That's one thing I want to make very clear. Even though I'm going to move on to other types of jazz pretty quickly, bebop will continue, and there'll be bebop musicians playing for decades. And then cool will continue, and hard bop will continue, and so all these things will continue to be played. But as the styles evolve, I want to introduce them to you, right? So we're going to move back to a more, again, approachable type of music, and that will eventually be called cool jazz. Cool jazz is different from bebop, where instead of being relatively, again, sort of husky, aggressive, angular, virtuosic, fast, it is lighter. It is the sound is drier. If you particularly listen to the alto saxophone of Paul Desmond, which I will introduce you to in the Dave Brubeck group, that describes his tone perfectly. It's very light. It's very clean. It's very dry. It doesn't have a lot of weight to it, right? There's not much vibrato. Vibrato is when the sound sort of goes bee like that, wiggles. That's fairly prominent in Charlie Parker's sound in particular. It's not prominent in cool jazz musicians' sound as much. It is just generally more compact. Bebop, the spectrum of dynamics, louds to softs, is wide. The spectrum of note selection from highs to lows is very, very wide, particularly with Dizzy Gillespie. The tempos are really, really fast, right? Cool jazz kind of just goes like this. We're going to put everything right here, right? It's going to be medium volume level. We're not going to play into the explosive high register. We're just going to stay right here and kind of cruise along right there. It is easy listening music before easy listening music was a thing. If you are familiar with the concept of what's called smooth jazz, which was a big thing in the 70s and 80s, cool jazz is sort of like, 40 years earlier, but it's sort of like a predecessor to smooth jazz in a lot of ways. It's just more compact and mellow. It's, again, easy listening, sort of relaxing music, okay? Again, began as a reaction to bebop in the mid 40s. Bebop is hard. It's complicated. Not everybody who wants to play jazz can hang with the degree of difficulty that Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie sort of inserted into that music. It was so hard. So cool jazz is less hard. Doesn't make it any less interesting or anything, but it's just less, demanding of the players. Okay, you're going to see a video clip explaining sort of Miles Davis's venture into cool. Miles Davis was started out as a bebop musician, but then found a home doing this more sort of relaxed, melodic, cool jazz. That's why I had you listen to Now's the Time and compare his trumpet improvisation style to that of Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie is fast, explosive, virtuosic. Miles Davis is relaxed, mellow, melodic, plays tunes, that kind of thing. So Miles Davis pairs with Gil Evans to produce the record Birth of the Cool, which is a landmark record in 1949 to 1950. It was a 9-piece group, which was a very odd sort of size. It wasn't a big band. It wasn't a small group. It was right in the middle. It had strange instruments like a tuba and a French horn. Gil Evans would use these sort of instruments that were not common in jazz to help fill out a tuba. When played the way Gil Evans wants it to be played, or a French horn in this context, it sounds full. It sounds fuller than regular jazz instruments. So it really makes the group sound kind of like bigger than it is. Okay. All right. So I'm going to put up some cool jazz for you that I want you to check out, at the end of our little lecture here. A couple Miles Davis things, a couple of West Coast cool things here as well. All right. So cool jazz was a great sort of soundtrack to this Western migration of people after World War II. A lot of people moved out to California to sun, relaxation, sort of that kind of stuff. California became a big draw. And this is before the Beach Boys were singing, California Girls and Fun, Fun, Fun. This is 20 years before that. But you get a lot of people moving towards the West Coast just to kind of new prospects and again, beautiful weather and that kind of stuff, right? So you get this development of the suburbs that happens after World War II, and not just in California, all across the country, but pre-World War II, there was a lot of urban and rural, but there wasn't suburban a whole lot. After World War II, you start to get this expanse of suburbia, where there's still downtown and there's still rural, but now the people who are working downtown are living further and further out and creating these sort of suburban oases, right? The music of cool jazz kind of works with that sort of watered down, blase sort of vanilla thing. It works. Development of suburbs created an atmosphere matched in the music. Many cool musicians gained popularity in California. And the term West Coast cool became almost a subset of cool, but it actually sort of came to dominate cool jazz, was this sort of West Coast thing. It became very popular in the 50s. And like I said, we'll never attain a level of popularity like we had during the swing era with jazz, but cool jazz got pretty close. You're at the big band era, very popular. It dips down to bebop because it gets so hard and complex, and then it kind of rises back up a little bit with cool jazz. But this is also before the arrival of rock and roll. We're in the early 50s. Rock and roll arrives around 1955. And then you also have the baby boomer generation, who by 1955, they're starting to sort of come of age. They're 9, 10 years old or younger siblings, and they're going to start buying less jazz records and more rock and roll records. So this is kind of like the last gasp of some form of popular jazz for a while, at least. Okay. You're going to get introduced, in addition to the Miles Davis clip with Gil Evans, you're also going to get introduced to the Dave Brubeck Quartet, which is a good representation of West Coast cool. Dave Brubeck played piano. Paul Desmond, who had, again, this very light, airy, dry sound on alto saxophone. Eugene Wright played bass. Joe Morello played the drums. Everyone in this band was white except Eugene Wright. So here you have an integrated group in the 50s, and they, like others, encountered some issues with that. Not nearly as much. Dave Brubeck and a lot of other particularly white cool musicians became pretty big stars. And they would have less problems with these sorts of issues because of that. It also led to a form of music that will come after cool jazz. That's sort of a reaction to the watered down vanilla and again sort of whiteness of cool jazz. But we'll get to that later on. That's called hard bop. Okay. The Dave Brubeck Quartet's most famous record is an album called Time Out, where they decided to make a bunch of tunes with weird time signatures. A time signature is, if you're not, if you don't have experience, in music as a kid or anything, a time signature tells you what the beat is and how many beats there are per grouping. So most pop music is in what we call common time or 4/4 time. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, bum, 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 bum. If you think of just about any march, bum, 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 everything's in 4. The vast majority of your favorite pop music, rock and roll, country music tunes, hip hop tunes, they're all in 4. 99.9% of pop music's in 4 easily. It's extremely common, and it's how it works. Sometimes you get other ones. Sometimes you'll get a 6. Sometimes you'll get a 3. Sometimes you get a 5. Sometimes you get weird things. But that's rare for that music to become popular. Dave Brubeck did a whole album of kind of odd time signatures. I'm going to put up 2 tunes for you. Blue Rondo a la Turk, which is actually in 12/8. But if you have a musical background, a 12/8, or actually it's in 9/8. I'm sorry, it's in 9/8. And typically 9/8 would be 3 beats of 3. So 3 times 3 is 9. It would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Bup, 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 bup. That's how 9/8 would work most of the time. This 9/8 of Blue Rondo a la Turk is more often actually grouped in 4, and that makes for an uneven division. So it goes 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 8, 9. 1 da 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 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. That's how it's going to work. They'll do that 3 times, and then they go into a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's you don't need to get too in the weeds with it, but it has a strange time signature, and that's Blue Rondo a la Turk, and it's a Turkish rhythm that he learned from Turkish musicians. It's a rondo, which means it's a form where material, it's fairly repetitive. Material keeps coming back over and over and over again, and it's kind of based on the blues. So that's why it gets the name Blue Rondo a la Turk. And then he does this other tune called Take 5, which is in 5. Do 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ba 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 boo ba boo ba ba beep boo boo. There's a good chance you've probably heard Take 5 before, or something like it. It's extremely well known. Brubeck just passed away 7 years ago already, or 6.5 years ago. Anyway, Dave Brubeck's group was probably the most well-known West Coast cool group for a very long time, and because of that, they had some hits, and they were able to command sort of large fees. The problem is, just like we had with Paul Whiteman, who was white and was called the King of Jazz, and made a lot more money than Fletcher Henderson's group, even though Fletcher Henderson's group was playing arguably actual jazz, where Paul Whiteman's group was not, and Paul Whiteman's group was playing a lot of just pop tunes, where Fletcher Henderson's band was more innovative. But again, it's a segregated society, and that's unfortunately how it works at this point. The same thing is going to happen here. A lot of great black musicians are kind of looking at groups like the Dave Brubeck Quartet or other white musicians and saying, those guys are playing pretty, generic stuff. Why are they having so much success, right? And we'll come back to that later on also, okay? One other form of cool jazz that I want to share with you is, again, a fusion with more Latin elements. We talked about this a little bit in bebop with Dizzy Gillespie. What happened in the 50s is you got the combination of jazz musicians, specifically Stan Getz, who was a great tenor saxophone player in the bebop tradition, but then sort of moved on into this. He fused with some Brazilian music, particularly bossa novas, sambas also, but bossa novas are the big one here. As you can see, bossa nova, right? He collaborated with some Brazilian artists, the Gilbertos, Yao and Astrid, and they made this record called Getz Gilberto. And it's full of these very mellow, very relaxed bossa novas. A bossa nova is Brazilian, and it fits West Coast cool really well because it's very just relaxed and cool and subtle and quiet, kind of. So it's a very relaxing environment for Stan Getz to improvise on. I'm going to share with you the tune, The Girl from Ipanema, which actually was shortened and edited into a radio-friendly version, with Astrid singing the verse in English and Stan Getz's solo was abbreviated. And that actually became a pop hit in the early 60s. It made the pop charts. But I'm giving you the longer version that appears on the album. And it starts with Yao Gilberto singing in Portuguese, and then Astrid Gilberto sings in English. And then it goes off into a tenor saxophone solo where Stan Getz can play in a very relaxed, easy fashion. And again, just like I had you do with sort of Miles Davis, Now's the Time versus his improv style versus Dizzy Gillespie's, right? I actually want you to do that again here. I want you to listen to Stan Getz at the end of Girl from Ipanema and just how relaxed and mellow. It's not explosive. He's not throwing 100 notes at you. He plays melodies and kind of pauses and gives you time to digest the music. Compare that to Charlie Parker's solo in Coco, which is just nonstop. Again, just your bass. The notes are like waves crashing over you one after the other, and you can't escape. They're radically different styles of playing. They're two different saxophones too. Charlie Parker plays alto. Stan Getz plays tenor, so they'll sound a little bit different, but it's really more about note selection and how much notes you're getting and that kind of thing. So check those two out. Okay. Cool jazz, again, was quite popular. It was adopted by films and television as sort of a soundtrack of the era. Mission Impossible, bum, 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 is in 5, just like Take 5 is. And there's a lot of similarities to that kind of stuff. So cool jazz is very much a sound of the late 50s and the early 60s. Even though in New York it started in the early 40s, it really became a thing by the early 50s, basically. Okay, so this is kind of like what we did with pop bands. With big bands, we broke them into categories: popular, artistic, and improvisational. The same thing is kind of with cool jazz. You have the West Coast and the East Coast. The West Coast is predominantly white. All of these musicians, Dave Brubeck, Paul Desmond, Stan Getz, Lee Konitz, Jerry Mulligan, Chet Baker, Stan Kenton, all white. And again, so there was a bit of a backlash against how are all these white musicians doing so well, when black musicians who created this music, who are innovating, the bebop musicians aren't doing as well. And on one level, you just have to say, well, cool jazz is easier, or perhaps for a lot of people more approachable than bebop is. So of course they're going to buy more cool jazz records than bebop records. You can't really fault them too much for that, right? On the East Coast, again, it kind of starts with a collaboration between Miles Davis and Gil Evans. You also have Bill Evans, who is a famous piano player who would work with Miles Davis later, Lenny Tristano, Lee Konitz, Jerry Mulligan. Some of these guys, Lee Konitz, Jerry Mulligan, and others, they started on the East Coast. These guys actually played on the Birth of the Cool album, eventually moved out to the West Coast, and and became West Coast musicians. Every single person on this list is white except Miles Davis. So the innovator of the new style, or the co-innovator, is black. But then everybody else kind of runs with it. And again, music is not as complex as bebop. So as far as, whatever you want to say about what you prefer to listen to or whatever, the most complex innovations are typically done by African Americans in this music. And then the white musicians come in and they imitate it and they copy it, and then they if they're good, they make their own changes and adaptations, and they profit from it. But oftentimes at the expense of the original creators in this case, which is Black artists. And again, we're in the 40s and 50s here. It's still very much a segregated society. So that's what's going to happen. All right, take a minute, go listen to the cool jazz things that I uploaded today. You're going to get a tune called Boplicity, which is off of the Birth of the Cool album. That's Miles Davis and the Nonette, right? I'm going to put up a tune called Walking Shoes, which is actually by Chet Baker and Jerry Mulligan. Chet Baker's a trumpet player. Jerry Mulligan is playing the saxophone. And it's very West Coast, relaxed, middle of the road stuff, right? You're going to get some Dave Brubeck, Blue Rondo a la Turk and Take 5. You're going to get some Stan Getz with Girl from Ipanema. So go again and do a little compare and contrast to bebop. If you have the time, listen to a cool jazz one, listen to a bebop one. Compare tempos, compare, if you listen to Sean Uff, for example, the melodic range that Dizzy Gillespie uses when he improvises, that's not there in any of these cool jazz tunes. The tempos, again, are more relaxed and slower. The dynamic levels, the volumes are just more compact and more relaxed, right? So go do a little bit of that, and then come back, and I want to talk about Third Stream, which is sort of a offshoot of cool jazz. All right, go. Okay, the last thing we'll talk about on this little lecture is Third Stream, which is, again, sort of an extension of cool jazz in a sense. Third Stream, the term is coined, it's attributed to the composer and French horn player Gunther Schuller, as well as a writer named John Wilson. You have a stream of jazz and the history of jazz, right? From its earliest beginnings, ragtime, swing era, bebop, now cool. You have a stream of jazz. And then you have a stream of classical music, which has gone on for, centuries, eons now, Bach and Beethoven and Schubert and Brahms and Wagner and all that kind of stuff, right? Third Stream is like a middle of the road. It's sort of it's jazz, but it also has elements of sort of classical music, and then it's carving out a new path. So that's the Third Stream, a combination of jazz and classical elements. That's it in a nutshell. It's going to help if you'll see the video clip, and that'll make some more sense. And I'm going to upload a couple things to help you sort of get it a little bit more as well. But this is another innovation of Miles Davis and Gil Evans. So Miles Davis, his fame grows throughout the 40s. He has the Birth of the Cool record, right? And I'm going to talk about Miles Davis actually in an upcoming lecture exclusively. But he has the Birth of the Cool record, and that is sort of him getting out on his own 2 feet, out from the Charlie Parker group, and now becoming a solo main draw his own. Then he starts to form his own groups. He starts to experiment with, 6-piece groups, 5-piece groups, other sorts of things, trying to, solidify what would eventually become the Miles Davis Quintet, right? And then he becomes more and more famous. He recorded for a smaller record label called Prestige for years and years and years. Finally, he was signed to a major record company, Columbia Records. And once he got with Columbia has the resources to do much larger scale things. So Miles Davis calls up Gil Evans from the cool jazz days, says, I just got signed to Columbia. We can do whatever we want. So Gil Evans shows up with these large scale things. Now, these aren't big bands in a swing band tradition, but they are bigger groups of instruments, like 17 or so piece instruments, lots of trumpets, trombones, lots of saxophones or reeds. They would double on flutes and clarinets, rhythm section. So it kind of would look like a jazz band, but you're not dancing to this music. It's not swing music. It's more classical music in a sense. It's more art. It's less entertainment and dance friendly, and it's more artist and individual expression. Okay. So with Third Stream, and particularly with Gil Evans, you incorporate instruments that are from the classical tradition that are rarely used in jazz. Again, tuba, French horn, which he did before. There's heavy reliance on an instrument called a flugelhorn, which is not a classical instrument, but it's a jazz instrument in particular. But it's played by trumpet players, and it's a conical instrument instead of a cylindrical instrument. We don't need to get into the weeds here, but it provides a more mellow or softer sound, similar to kind of like a French horn, actually. Oboes and flutes are not typically jazz instruments, although lots of people play jazz flute and improvise on flute. Oboe less so, but there's incorporating these. They're not even played in a jazz manner. They're played in a classical manner. More use of strings, things like that. And they would also incorporate formal elements. So instead of 12-bar blues, instead of 32-bar standard American song forms that have been used now in jazz for 50 years, they're now going to even try to experiment with classical music forms like concertos, like fugues, theme and variations, and things like that. I'm going to upload, there's 3 giant albums that you're going to hear about in the video clip if you haven't already. Sketches of Spain, Miles Ahead, and Porgy and Bess. I'm going to upload a couple of tracks from some of these albums just to give you an idea. The Porgy and Bess in particular, and Sketches of Spain, I'm going to do 2 different things. You're going to get a song called Summertime, which is a kind of a big hit from Porgy and Bess. Porgy and Bess was an opera written by an American popular song composer named George Gershwin. He was experimenting outside of pop tunes and started to do more classical music. He wrote piano concertos and orchestral pieces. Well, Porgy and Bess is an opera, and there's an aria in it. An aria in an opera is a solo song, and it's entitled Summertime, and it's really a pop song because George Gershwin wrote pop tunes. But anyway. Long story short, I'm going to give you 2 versions. I'm going to provide a link to an opera singer singing it, how it would sound in the opera. It might not. I don't think it's going to be from an opera. It'll be from a stage version, but that's not important. This is how it was written, and this is how it was supposed to sound when performed in an opera. Then I'm going to play you the Miles Davis version. The Porgy and Bess record is just Gil Evans taking some of the greatest tunes from Porgy and Bess and reorchestrating them for his third stream group. And then Miles Davis takes over the role of the singer, of the opera singer, but he's doing it with his trumpet. So listen to a little bit. You don't have to listen to the whole thing if you don't need to, but listen to a little bit of the actual opera one, and then listen to the Miles Davis, Gil Evans version and see what they did to it, right? The same thing is going to happen with the Sketches of Spain album, where they took some music by Spanish composers, and there's a couple of original compositions by Gil Evans also that are Spanish flavored. But I'm going to upload the Concerto de Aranjuez, the second movement. It's actually a guitar concerto by Albanese, I believe. And I'm going to I'll give you, again, a slice of the authentic thing, a guitar player playing it with an orchestra. And you don't need to listen to the entire thing. Just listen to the first couple of minutes, and that's the real deal, right? Then I'm going to share with you the Miles Davis version off the album, where Gil Evans, again, took this orchestral piece, reorchestrated it for his ensemble, his third stream ensemble, and gave the solo part, the guitar part, that was then reinterpreted by Miles Davis on trumpet. And that's kind of what third stream was. Other musicians were exploring this. Other people did this. By far the biggest and most well-known of these third stream records are these 3 Miles Davis and Gil Evans collaborations. But this is sort of an example of what third stream was. It was relatively popular at that time. And now in modern day jazz, there are still some groups that kind of experiment with this. Maria Schneider and her band would be an example. Occasionally she writes music that is sort of like a new wave of third streamy with these sorts of combinations. So anyway, so that's cool jazz and third stream in a nutshell. Watch the video clips, please. Do the film worksheets. Send them to me when you're done. Listen to all of the other material and really take the time to compare some of the cool jazz things with the bebop. Compare the opera or symphony orchestra versions of the authentic versions of these tunes with the new third stream versions of these tunes, just so you see where everything's coming from. All right, that's it, friends. Well done. And next time we'll start talking about Miles Davis more in depth. Okay, have a great day. Bye bye.